In today's Florida, HOA fees are no longer a minor detail tucked into the fine print. They're not just the cost of maintaining a pool or keeping the clubhouse tidy. In many cases, they've evolved into what feels like a second mortgage layered on top of the first. In certain cities, these escalating fees are quietly tightening the entire housing market, creating a slow, grinding pressure that's hard to see at first, but impossible to ignore once it sets in. Here's where things start to get risky. Most buyers begin their search focused on the listing price. They run the numbers, calculate the mortgage, and feel confident they understand what the monthly payment will look like. Then, the HOA fee enters the picture. $400 a month, $600, $900. In some neighborhoods, even higher. When you stack that on top of climbing insurance premiums, rising property taxes, and elevated interest rates, the payment that once looked manageable on paper can quickly transform into a financial strain in the real world. And the pressure doesn't end with the monthly dues. Across many Florida communities, HOA regulations can restrict rentals, prevent certain renovations, mandate expensive repairs, or impose special assessments that show up like an unexpected bill from another dimension. So today on Discover the Cities, we're breaking down 10 Florida cities where HOA pressure is weighing heavily on the housing market in 2026. And this isn't only about higher monthly dues. It's about shifting buyer psychology, cooling demand, and pushing sellers into the most uncomfortable phase of any real estate cycle. Be sure to stay until the end, because the number one city on this list is where soaring HOA fees, insurance strain, and investor-owned inventory collide to create one of the harshest affordability challenges anywhere in the state. Coming in at number 10, we're heading to Jacksonville, a city that many still view as Florida's last great affordability loophole. For years, Jacksonville has carried the reputation of being the state's pressure valve. Massive land area, constant new construction, and a steady stream of families moving in for jobs, bigger homes, and prices that look modest compared to South Florida. On the surface, it still checks those boxes. But something subtle is shifting beneath that narrative. Quietly and steadily, the HOA is becoming the new gatekeeper of affordability in Jacksonville. A big part of the city's expansion has come from freshly built subdivisions. And with new subdivisions almost always comes an HOA. That alone isn't unusual. It's been the standard model for years. What is unusual is the speed at which dues are climbing and how many different layers of fees are stacking up. In some neighborhoods, you're not just paying one association. You might owe dues to a master association and a separate neighborhood association. Then there are amenity fees. In certain areas, you'll also see CDD-style district assessments added in. Now, layer on the surge in homeowners insurance and property taxes. Suddenly, a home that appears reasonably priced at first glance can carry a monthly payment that balloons far beyond expectations. And this is where the market reaction becomes obvious. Buyers today aren't just focused on the purchase price. They're laser-focused on the total monthly obligation. Once that number crosses a psychological threshold, demand cools almost immediately. HOAs also change how liquid a property feels. A home without an HOA comes across as flexible and straightforward. A home with a heavy HOA can feel more like entering into a binding contract, complete with rules, restrictions, approval requirements, rental caps, and sometimes structured fines. When the market is red hot, buyers are willing to overlook that. But in a more cautious environment, those same restrictions can become deal breakers. So in Jacksonville, we're not necessarily seeing a dramatic collapse triggered by HOAs. Instead, we're witnessing something quieter but still meaningful. Longer days on market, more price cuts, more sellers offering concessions, and more buyers gravitating toward older, non-HOA neighborhoods where they feel greater control over their expenses. At number 9, we land in Orlando. Orlando has always been fueled by a powerful growth story. Theme parks, expanding job opportunities, steady in-migration, and new construction pushing farther and farther outward. That constant expansion is exactly what makes the HOA dynamic so influential here. The city's housing landscape is dominated by master-planned communities. In other words, HOA fees aren't the exception in Orlando. They're the standard operating model. Here's where the tension builds. Orlando's buyer base tends to be extremely payment conscious. A large share of households relocating here are doing so because they were priced out of the states they came from. They're trying to make Florida financially feasible. In many cases, they're stretching to achieve home ownership. And when you're stretching, every recurring expense counts. Add rising HOA dues into that equation, and the pressure tightens quickly. When monthly fees increase, buyers feel the squeeze. When special assessments appear, homeowners feel blindsided. When rental restrictions tighten, investors start to feel boxed in. And when investors begin to feel constrained, they look for the exit. As more investor-owned properties hit the market, the entire character of a neighborhood can start to shift. Orlando has another layer to this issue that makes it especially sensitive: short-term rental policies. Some communities allow them, others strictly prohibit them. And in certain cases, the rules evolve over time. That unpredictability turns HOA governance into a major market variable. Buyers don't just look at the house. They're thinking ahead. Can I rent this out later if I need to? Could this become a backup plan? If my finances change, can I offset the payment? If the HOA blocks those options, the property instantly loses a degree of flexibility. And with that, some of its perceived value. That's why in Orlando, HOA dynamics aren't just about higher monthly costs. They're about limiting optionality. They chip away at buyer confidence. They stretch out days on market. And they quietly transform once booming neighborhoods into markets where negotiation becomes the norm instead of the exception. At number 8, we're looking at Tampa. For years, Tampa has been one of the most talked about real estate markets in Florida. Strong job growth, an attractive lifestyle, and a steady wave of newcomers from the Northeast and Midwest chasing sunshine and tax relief helped fuel that reputation. But now, HOA pressure in Tampa is starting to feel less like a background detail and more like a serious affordability barrier, particularly in the suburban outskirts where much of the newer construction has taken place. Here's the shift. Many buyers who purchased during the boom years were willing to accept sizable HOA fees because they assumed rapid appreciation would make the numbers work. Rising home values were expected to offset the ongoing costs. Today, the pace of the market has cooled. And when momentum slows, people start examining their monthly expenses more carefully. Suddenly, that HOA payment doesn't feel like a minor trade-off. It feels like a burden. In numerous Tampa area communities, homeowners are paying for amenities they rarely use, yet the dues continue to climb anyway. Add in aging infrastructure, things like community pools, roofing systems, private roads, gated entrances, and extensive landscaping, and the likelihood of special assessments increases. And that's where the real anxiety kicks in. An HOA fee of $500 per month is one thing, but a surprise assessment of $10,000, $15,000, or even $20,000 due within a short window is something else entirely. That kind of unexpected financial hit makes buyers far more cautious. And cautious buyers don't drive bidding wars. In Tampa, this dynamic shows up as a noticeable shift in demand. More buyers are gravitating toward older neighborhoods with fewer restrictions and lower recurring fees. In HOA-heavy communities, negotiations are tougher. Sellers are trimming prices or offering credits to keep deals alive. At number 7, we head to Fort Myers. Fort Myers is part of a region long defined by retirees, seasonal residents, and buyers drawn to the Gulf Coast dream. Sunsets, beaches, gated entries, resort-style amenities. That lifestyle has always been the selling point. And ironically, that's exactly why HOA pressure can hit so hard here. Many communities in Fort Myers are condo-dense, gated, and built around shared amenities. Even under stable conditions, that structure tends to produce higher HOA dues. But 2026 is anything but stable. Insurance premiums have climbed sharply. Maintenance expenses are up. Repair costs have jumped. In condo-style associations especially, those rising expenses typically feed directly into the HOA's operating budget. So what's the chain reaction? Dues increase. Buyers hesitate. Listings linger. Sellers reduce prices. And then another, more destabilizing dynamic begins to unfold. Some homeowners, particularly those living on fixed incomes, simply can't absorb the higher monthly costs. So they list their units, often around the same time. When multiple owners in the same community try to sell simultaneously, inventory clusters. And clustered inventory often forces a price reset. This is where the squeeze becomes visible. The HOA isn't just a recurring fee. It becomes a trigger for synchronized selling, especially in communities heavily populated by retirees. Once several units from the same association hit the market, buyers start viewing that HOA as a potential warning sign. Even if the buildings themselves appear well kept, they begin asking tougher questions. What major repairs are coming? Are the reserves fully funded? Has maintenance been deferred? Is another special assessment around the corner? That uncertainty directly affects how buyers behave. Offers come in lower, credits are requested. Some buyers walk away entirely and look for a nearby property without an HOA. At number 6, we arrive in Sarasota. Sarasota has long carried the image of a prestige coastal market, scenic, upscale, and highly sought after. It's the kind of place people associate with beauty, culture, and waterfront living. Yet in 2026, Sarasota is also demonstrating how HOA governance can quietly act as a ceiling on the market, even in locations where demand is traditionally strong. A significant share of Sarasota's buyers are looking for flexibility. Think second homeowners, snowbirds, semi-retirees, people who want the freedom to come and go on their own terms. HOA communities often advertise convenience, maintenance-free living, and orderly surroundings. But that structure comes with strings attached: rental caps, approval boards, renovation guidelines, parking limitations, guest policies, pet restrictions. When the market is moving fast, buyers tend to overlook those rules. In a slower environment, however, those same restrictions create friction, and friction cools demand. Then there's the financial layer. HOA dues in Sarasota are often substantial, particularly in condo communities where fees can climb into very high territory. If a buyer is already facing a sizable mortgage payment and then sees another large monthly HOA obligation stacked on top, the deal can unravel quickly. There's also a quieter concern shaping behavior here. Even when current HOA dues appear stable, buyers are increasingly focused on what could happen next year. What happens when insurance policies renew? What if the building requires significant structural upgrades? In 2026, purchasers aren't just evaluating the individual unit. They're scrutinizing the financial health of the entire association. If the reserve funds look thin or the budget feels strained, hesitation sets in. Buyers request documentation, review financials carefully, and often slow the transaction process. As a result, Sarasota's housing market may look solid in headlines and overall metrics. But within HOA-governed communities, conditions can be much softer. Longer days on market, more negotiation, and increased seller concessions. At number 5, we turn to Naples. Naples perfectly illustrates how an HOA-driven market can look luxurious on the surface while quietly delivering serious financial strain underneath. Buyers often enter these gated communities believing they're purchasing exclusivity, safety, and an elevated lifestyle. And they are. But they're also signing up for a monthly obligation that can increase with very little warning. Naples is home to some of the highest HOA and condo association fees in Florida. Not every neighborhood carries extreme costs, but in many of the most desirable communities, the dues are substantial. In 2026, those hefty fees are colliding with elevated insurance premiums, rising property taxes, and growing maintenance expenses. Here's how that pressure spills into the market. Naples certainly attracts affluent buyers, but not all of them are paying cash. A significant number finance their purchases. Others leverage assets. Many buy second homes with plans to rent seasonally or resell down the line. When HOA fees climb, the investment math starts to fall apart. And when the numbers stop working, investors rethink their position. That often leads to more listings. As inventory builds, price reductions tend to follow. Naples also carries a distinct special assessment risk because so many communities are built around high-end amenities. Golf courses, expansive clubhouses, private streets, extensive landscaping, gated security, all of it requires ongoing funding. When those systems need major upgrades or repairs, The resulting assessments can be steep. The moment a particular community becomes known for large assessments, the buyer pool can shrink quickly. Even high-income purchasers dislike unpredictability. They want ownership costs they can forecast. What they don't want is a surprise five-figure bill tied to decisions made by an association board. That's why Naples earns its place on this list. Here, the HOA isn't simply a recurring fee. It's an entire financial structure capable of delivering sudden cost shocks powerful enough to trigger selling, even in one of Florida's wealthiest markets. At number 4, we head into Boca Raton. Now we're in South Florida, where HOA pressure operates on an entirely different level. Boca Raton is affluent, highly desirable, and backed by steady demand. But it's also saturated with gated enclaves, high-rise condo buildings, and neighborhoods tightly managed by associations. Here's the critical distinction. In Boca, HOA dues aren't just covering basic maintenance. They're funding a brand. They support polished landscaping, layered security, resort-style amenities, strict architectural standards, and rules that are often enforced with precision. That level of control creates a cost structure that can escalate quickly. And in a market where purchase prices are already elevated, the HOA fee can easily become the deciding factor that kills a deal. There's another dimension shaping behavior here. Recent condo association reforms and heightened reserve requirements across Florida have put a spotlight on building finances. Buyers are paying much closer attention to reserves, deferred maintenance, and the possibility of assessments. If an association's reserves appear thin, alarm bells go off. If monthly dues are already high, affordability becomes a concern. If the rules feel restrictive, flexibility becomes the issue. And in Boca Raton, flexibility matters more than many people acknowledge. Buyers want the freedom to rent the property later if circumstances change. They want to renovate without navigating a maze of approvals. They want to hold the property without feeling squeezed by unpredictable increases in monthly costs. When those options feel limited, confidence erodes quickly. There's also a practical comparison happening in buyers' minds. Two properties may carry the exact same list price, but once HOA dues are factored in, they can feel like completely different financial commitments. That realization naturally shifts demand toward non-HOA pockets and away from towers and gated communities that rely on association-based living. At number 3, we arrive in Miami. Miami operates on a global stage. The skyline is iconic, the brand is powerful, cash buyers are common, and headlines never seem to stop. But when it comes to HOAs, this isn't some side issue in Miami. It's a central pillar of how the housing market functions. The city is packed with condos and soaring high-rise towers, and in those buildings, association dues can reach staggering levels. Now layer in climbing insurance premiums, higher maintenance expenses, increased security costs, and stricter reserve funding requirements. The result? A monthly obligation that can feel like carrying a second mortgage right on top of the first. Here's how that plays out in the market. A buyer might comfortably afford the purchase price of the condo itself, but hesitate when confronted with the ongoing HOA burden. Add in the possibility of special assessments or internal governance disputes, and some buyers simply decide to pause. And when buyers hesitate, sellers are forced to compete. Miami also has a strong investor presence. Many units were originally purchased with a strategy in mind. Rent it out, flip it for profit, hold it long-term, or use it seasonally. But if an HOA tightens rental restrictions, increases dues, or announces a sizable assessment, that carefully built plan can unravel quickly. When investment math breaks down, listings tend to increase. And once inventory builds within the same building, a familiar pattern emerges. Units that once would have moved in days begin sitting on the market. Sellers start offering credits. Then come the price reductions, followed by more reductions. From a distance, Miami's real estate market can still appear strong and glamorous. But inside certain towers, the reality may be slower, heavier, and far more negotiable. Once buyers sense they have leverage, even in a luxury high-rise, that psychological shift spreads fast. The urgency fades. People compare options more carefully. They negotiate harder. They demand stronger terms. In Miami, HOA pressure acts as an amplifier. It magnifies shifts in demand and can trigger sudden waves of listings, especially when multiple owners within the same building decide the ongoing monthly burden simply no longer makes sense. At number 2, we're looking at Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale operates right in the heart of the South Florida engine: coastal appeal, steady tourism, concentrated wealth, and ongoing development. But it's also one of the most HOA-saturated markets in the state. Condos dominate the skyline. Waterfront towers line the coast. Gated communities stretch inland. Association governance is practically everywhere. The formula here isn't new, it's just more intense. Take already high property prices, stack on substantial HOA dues, add soaring insurance premiums, and what you get is a buyer pool that starts to narrow. When fewer buyers qualify or feel comfortable moving forward, listings begin to linger. As listings sit, sellers trim prices. As price cuts spread, comparable sales reset. And that sequence, shrinking demand, longer market times, lower comps, is exactly how a market transitions. There's another shift happening in Fort Lauderdale as well. Buyers today are far less tolerant of uncertainty. They want to see the HOA's financial statements. They ask for reserve studies. They scrutinize rules and bylaws. Transparency matters more than ever. If the association's finances look shaky or unclear, many buyers simply walk away, even in a city that remains highly desirable. And once a handful of units in the same building close at lower prices, the ripple effect spreads quickly. Appraisers use those transactions as benchmarks. Future sellers lose negotiating leverage. Buyers gain confidence. A building that once commanded a premium can feel pressured almost overnight. Fort Lauderdale has one additional vulnerability. Buyers here often compare similar towers and communities side by side. If one building carries HOA dues that are hundreds of dollars lower per month than another, that difference becomes a powerful negotiating tool. It's common to hear a buyer say, "I love your unit, but the building down the street costs significantly less each month." At that point, sellers are left with limited options: reduce the price or offer concessions. In Fort Lauderdale, HOA fees are no longer a background detail buried in the fine print. They've become part of the effective purchase price, part of the financial risk calculation, and a major reason sellers are once again competing for serious buyers. At number 1, we land in Weston, the Florida city where HOA pressure is hitting the housing market the hardest in 2026. Weston stands out because it perfectly demonstrates how strong HOA governance can quietly reshape a city's buyer pool, weaken pricing power, and complicate resale, often before homeowners fully realize what they've stepped into. This city has long been known for its polished appearance, master-planned communities, pristine landscaping, family-friendly marketing, and highly rated schools. For years, that image created a sense of security. Buyers treated Weston like a safe bet, a place where demand would always remain steady. But in 2026, Weston is feeling the broader affordability squeeze affecting Florida. And here, the HOA structure acts as a multiplier. In Weston, HOA oversight isn't occasional. It's embedded into the framework of many neighborhoods. Governance is layered and consistent. Residents often feel like they're funding a specific lifestyle standard every single month. Guard gates, shared amenities, detailed maintenance expectations, active rule enforcement, and one consistent reality: the dues rarely decrease. During the boom years, most buyers overlooked that. They were focused on getting into the community, confident that appreciation would offset the recurring costs. Now the calculation looks different. Buyers are breaking down the full equation: mortgage payment, property taxes, insurance premiums, and then the HOA fee. A home that appears reasonably priced at first glance can feel far less affordable once the total monthly obligation is clear. That recalculation shifts demand quickly. The moment buyers encounter a high recurring fee, payment-sensitive families often step back. Listings begin to linger. Then there's the friction layer: rental limitations, renovation approvals, restrictions on vehicles, pet policies, landscaping rules, solar panel constraints, even limitations on basic exterior changes. In a slower market, that level of oversight can move from being a minor inconvenience to a deal-breaking obstacle. Weston becomes a case study in how this plays out. Even if headline prices remain relatively elevated, resale stability becomes fragile because the buyer pool is filtered through both cost and compliance. The most destabilizing factor, however, is the potential for sudden increases. As association budgets grow, vendor contracts rise, insurance costs climb, and maintenance expenses expand, dues follow. For homeowners operating on tight budgets, that creates pressure. When they decide, or are forced to sell, they often price aggressively. Those sales reset comparable values. Appraisals tighten, negotiations intensify. The market tone shifts from confidence to caution. If you're in Weston, what are you seeing right now? Are HOA fees climbing? Are properties sitting longer? Are buyers asking for concessions? What this entire countdown highlights is not that every Florida neighborhood is collapsing. Florida is not a single uniform market. It's a patchwork of micro-markets. But HOAs are emerging as a statewide force because they consistently introduce three pressures buyers cannot ignore. They increase the monthly payment. They inject uncertainty through assessments and evolving rules. And they limit flexibility at a time when flexibility matters more than ever. In 2026, buyers aren't just shopping for a home. They're evaluating whether they can realistically sustain the total monthly burden. And for a growing number of households, the HOA is the factor that transforms a dream property into something financially out of reach. If this breakdown gave you clarity on what's really happening beneath the headlines, consider liking the video, subscribing to Discover the Cities, and dropping a comment with the next Florida city you'd like us to analyze.